Hi, everybody. This is Tim Lotus with discussion board number 7. And today I'm going to discuss my pet subject about the banking collapse of 1931 and how that's a more accurate start to the Great Depression than the overemphasized stock collapse of 1929, which was mild in comparison to the effects of the banking collapse, which started in Central Europe in the spring of 1931 and spread to the United States during the fall, when we saw a real big increase in unemployment and bank failures, and in my opinion, made the recession really unprecedented during that time. And one is a book, two are articles. The first one was about the bank collapse specifically in one American city, Toledo. And Toledo is generally known as the city that was hit worse, especially during the early Great Depression, than any other city in the United States. It's estimated to 50% unemployment, perhaps, because they were centered on the durable goods industry and heavy manufacturing, and that was one of the hardest hit sectors in the Great Depression. And they had a major collapse of banks and a lot of loss of funds there, and that's what this book is about. It goes through some aspects of political corruption and racketeering, but the part I was most focused on reading was their bank collapse in 1931. According to this source, 3 out of the top 23 bank collapses in the United States during the Great Depression took place in Toledo, a city that's not even the largest or second largest in its own state. And it had 3 of the top 23. That's pretty significant. And it also, more importantly, had the highest average monetary losses per bank account. They lost, on average, people who had their money in banks that collapsed in Toledo lost $430, which is about $8,000 to $10,000 today. And it was way higher than any other place, like New York, for instance. It was $44, which was more typical of the average that people would lose. So people in Toledo lost a lot of money. And more importantly, though, was how it helped prove my case by showing that in the early 1931, things appeared to be turning around in Toledo. And I found other evidence through other sources that other cities also, things were looking better in early 1931 before the European bank collapse affected the United States and brought everything down with it. According to this book, bank profits in the city, including the banks that went under, were actually going up in the first quarter of the year. Retail sales were up in the first part of the year also. And it was the general optimism that things had turned around until June, they said, is when the collapse started, and that's when things really started getting heated in Europe, and it started affecting us over here. The second feature I have is an article called "When the North Headed South," the North meaning the northern industrial countries. And it's really a comparison between the bad effects of the Great Recession that occurred in 2008 and 9 and the early Great Depression. And what I was most interested in is the statistics it offered as far as how bad 1931 was, especially compared to 29 and 30. One chart showed global exports averages, and it showed they were up 1.3 in 1929, down 13.3 in 1930, and down a whopping 33.3 in 1931 before evening out a bit and going to negative 17% in 1932. So 1931 was by far the worst year for a decline in exports globally. And just for comparison, the recession before that in the early 1920s, the worst year was 1921, which was 19.8%, which shows that 1931 was the only year that was higher than that. It also showed how the crisis of 1931 affected interest rates. The 3-month Treasury bill before most of 1931, before September, was about 0.5%. After Britain left the pound and a major wave of bank collapses started in the United States, the interest rate for the 3-month went up to 3% for the rest of the fall, and then dropped in early 1932, and things stabilized a bit. And it never actually got above even 1% after that, even though it was above 3% for a few months in the end of 1931. Shows how severe it really was. And the last was simply called The Great Depression by Alan Brinkley. It was just an article about the causes of the Great Depression. Goes through most of the average things about the stock of 29, but it doesn't really show, any cataclysmic effects until 1931, when it goes over how the Dawes Plan caused so much overinvestment in Central Europe. And Central Europe was just kept borrowing money to pay over their previous short-term debts, and it was just a house of cards that was just waiting to collapse, and it did in 1931. And it really hurt the American banks because they had lent so much money since the end of the World War to help rebuild Central Europe, and a lot of it went to useless reparations payments and other things that didn't really cause much economic growth, and came to the United States when all the European banks started collapsing and caused a major crisis here, far worse than the stock crash did. Thanks for listening.